Before I introduce our guest today, Peter Cole, I wanted to take a moment to welcome everyone who's listening in from far and wide, and to invite them to participate in this conversation if they have questions by using the Q&A function right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There'll be about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the hour in which I'll take those questions and pose them to Peter. So I should say I'm really excited to be able to talk with Peter Cole today. Peter is a historian at the University of Western Illinois, or Western Illinois University, and the author of this really great book, which I have right here, and which I read again last week. So this is the revised and expanded second edition of Ben Fletcher, The Life and Times of a Black Wobbly, put out by PM Press. It's a fantastic book, so I would encourage anyone who's interested in labor history and the history of the I.W.W. or the Industrial Workers of the World to pick it up and to check it out. And even if you're not interested in those things, I think it speaks to a set of broader questions on everything from labor and racial capitalism to the struggle for racial justice and where organized labor and trade unions and fit into that. So I guess I should say, Peter, welcome to Reinventing Solidarity, and congrats on this book, which is great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your kind words, and I'm thrilled to sort of be with you and with everyone who's showed up today. Thank you so much for everyone attending.
Great. All right. Well, let's start off. So maybe we should just kind of begin with the basics, which is who is Ben Fletcher? Why does he merit our attention? Why does he not only merit this book, but now two books? I think, who is this? Who is this person? Tell us.
Well, of course. So Ben Fletcher was an African-American born in Philadelphia in 1890 to working class parents who had fled the South a few years prior in the era of rising racism and violence, sort of technically before Jim Crow segregation begins, but in the aftermath of the failure of Reconstruction. And Fletcher, working class kid, streets of South Philadelphia around the age of 19. He joined, around the age of 1920 in 1910. He joins the I.W.W., the Industrial Workers of the World, whose members are nicknamed the Wobblies, as well as the Socialist Party, and quickly became a very well-known locally as a prominent Wobbly speaker. He also quickly became known as the most prominent African-American in the entire national organization. And then a few years later in 1913, he helped found and then subsequently led a union of dock workers in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, which was the third biggest city in the country and maybe the fifth biggest port in the country, and whose workers on the waterfront who load and unload ships were approximately 1/3 African-American, 1/3 Irish-American and Irish immigrants, and about 1/3 other European immigrants. And the union, which was chartered as Local 8, was arguably the most racially and ethnically diverse union of its time, or for that matter, several generations. Arguably the most integrated institution of its time, not just union. I mean, even the NAACP in the 19-teens was led by a white man. And for the next decade, Local 8, with Fletcher often at the helm, was the most powerful, militant, radical union, because the Wobblies were, from their inception to this day, committed to socialism and the fight against capitalism. And so that Fletcher was really the most prominent Black revolutionary unionist in his generation, period. He was praised by A. Philip Randolph repeatedly, especially in his Harlem-based magazine called The Messenger, as well as by W.E.B. Du Bois. He was praised by Wobblies, of course, like Big Bill Haywood and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. He was praised by communists like Earl Browder and Harry Haywood. But he's largely forgotten. Yeah, I mean, even among sort of historians of labor and the left in the United States, very few people know much about him, if anything. I often compare him to Fred Hampton, the sort of Black Panther who was murdered in Chicago in 1969. Both were African-American men who began their organizing in their late teens. Both were revolutionaries committed to socialism. Both belonged to organizations that were anti-racist and worked across ethnic and racial boundaries. I mean, because the Panthers were not a Black nationalist organization, really, because they very much were a left-wing organization that worked with whites and Puerto Ricans and Chicanos who were committed to the same political goals. But Hampton is actually much better known, even has a movie coming out about him this month, right? Like Fletcher, totally forgotten, right? But really in their early 20s, they were sort of in the same place. Actually, you could even argue that Fletcher did more. I mean, not to sort of compare in that way, but if you've heard of Fred Hampton, or I say if you've heard of Stokely Carmichael, or if you've heard of A. Philip Randolph, Fletcher should be in that list as one of the most important Black revolutionaries of 20th century America.
Okay, so if there are any screenwriters listening in, here's your cue. So maybe you said a lot there. Maybe we could step back a bit and just give us a sense of the organization that that Ben Fletcher was part of, the Wobblies, and how they fit into this kind of broader landscape of both radical politics and not radical politics. That is, what is their relationship with the AFL? What is their relationship with the Garveyite movement? What is their, what did it mean to be a Wobbly in the first 2 decades of the 20th century?
Well, I mean, the sort of sarcastic but true answer is, what did it mean to be a Wobbly is to put a big target on your back, because the federal government would sort of arrest you and put you in prison like Fletcher did, serving time in Leavenworth. But, the I.W.W. was founded in Chicago in 1905. Then it was the greatest industrial city in the country and maybe the world. And it was founded because the American Federation of Labor, which was a small collection of mostly craft unions, was largely committed to so-called bread and butter unionism or pork chop unionism. Can we make a little more money? Can we have a little more power? But really, the AFL had intentionally chosen, because of its sort of lowercase p politics, not organize many African Americans, not organize women, not organize most immigrants, not organize most unskilled workers. And so the AFL chose to not organize most workers, right? There's this huge void. That's because of their huge blind spots, a lot of which were sort of connected to racism and sexism and xenophobia. Those who formed the Wobblies were a who's who of the left. Eugene Debs was a founder of the I.W.W. after leading the Pullman strike, but founding the Socialist Party. Lucy Parsons was at the founding convention, the widow of Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket martyrs, had herself a prominent Chicago anarchist. Big Bill Haywood, who was the leader of the most militant union at that time, the Western Federation of Miners, right? Mother Jones was at the was a founder of the I.W.W. And this union was intentionally anti-AFL. It was anti-capitalist, where the AFL actually had no beef, if you will, with capitalism. B, was sort of anti-nationalist, right? Rejected putting the nation, Industrial Workers of America, in their name, but intentionally made themselves internationalists in their imagination, because they believed then, and maybe now too, of course, that capitalism was global, and so therefore the struggle should be global. And 3, right, was going to be all-inclusive, right, of all types of workers, regardless of the sort of work you did, whether you were so-called skilled or unskilled, regardless of your race, nationality, sex, et cetera, religion. And so the Wobblies did what the AFL chose not to do, right? So Fletcher, who joined the I.W.W. 6 or 7 years later, right? But the I.W.W. quickly sort of became a large radical union, never as large numerically as AFL, but also within a decade was operating in 24 countries, right, on every continent where humans lived, right, and was anti-racist in those places too, yeah. And so I always like the example of the I.W.W. started organizing in New Zealand because New Zealanders who were living in America moved back to New Zealand and started to organize under the I.W.W. banner. It was the first union in New Zealand to organize Maori workers, right? These sort of indigenous working class, right? Which white socialists chose not to organize because they claimed to be socialists, but they were also white supremacists. And so I could talk further about these matters, but that's the union, right? The I.W.W. that Fletcher was a part of. The last thing I guess I'd say is that they were intentionally industrial, right? And so rather than organizing craft-based unions, carpenters in one union, plumbers in a second, building plumbers, electricians in a third, right? Instead, you have a single building workers union, right? You have a single industry-wide union because employers were more powerful and collaborated, and workers who were in craft unions often actually were pitted against themselves. So you have carpenters going on strike, but plumbers have to cross the line because they have a contract. And so that sort of notion of working class solidarity is really at the core of the I.W.W. vision, as embedded in their motto, an injury to one is an injury to all.
Right. Okay. So I have so many thoughts on what you just said. One of them, and I think I'm gonna probably come back to it later. I'm writing it down so I don't forget, because at some point I want, maybe you can talk about the difference between the kind of interracial unionism or interracial approach to the question of organized labor that the I.W.W. put forward, and how it related to the kind of the Knights of Labor, 2 or 3 decades prior, and then also the development of the CIO unions in the 1930s. But I think, just to continue on the Fletcher thing, I mean, you started your comments with this, to be a member of the I.W.W. was to have a target on your back. And I think that's important because it shows up in the cover of the book, which is a mugshot of Ben Fletcher. And I assume this is after he was indicted on trumped up sedition charges in 1917. And that's a huge part of the story, repression of radicals at that time. But Ben Fletcher is actually probably, apart from being locked in prison with the likes of Big Bill Hayward and other I.W.W. luminaries, but his work organizing for I.W.W., the story you tell is one about dock workers in Philadelphia and the development of Local 8. Tell us, what was Local 8? What did Fletcher do in Philadelphia? How was he successful there? Or what did success look like for him there?
Yeah, so in Philadelphia, which is a river town, not an ocean, right, like New York City, which is essentially on the Atlantic, Philadelphia is upriver, up the Delaware River, which flows into the Chesapeake 100 miles downriver. And it's also at the confluence of the Schuylkill and the Delaware, which is why William Penn, the sort of Quaker founder of the colony, located it where it is. It's in between. It's this small city, 2 miles wide, right? Where these two rivers, Delaware being a somewhat great river, comes together. And because Philadelphia was such an important industrial city, it was sort of exported all sorts of manufactured goods, everything from battleships to button hooks. It also was exporting through Pennsylvania lots of coal and iron and huge raw materials and bringing in all these things. There were thousands of men who worked on the waterfront every day. Fletcher was one of those people, right? He had first worked in the trade before he was a union organizer, right? And this industry was notorious for abusive hiring, where thousands might show up for hundreds of jobs, and employers would basically play workers off each other by race, by religion, by neighborhood, and also demand often bribes for getting hired. And all the effect of this is that not only was the work casual, labor was weak, wages were low, but the shape up, as it was called, which is famous also from the movie On the Waterfront in the 1950s and the Hoboken, New York port, right, was hated, right? Like, so after Local 8 strikes for recognition in the spring of 1913 and wins a 2-week strike, not only did they win material gains like wage increases, they end the shape up, right? Like,
wait, what's the shape up? Tell us.
I'm sorry. The shape up was the nickname of the hiring system that I just described briefly, which is this sort of melee where thousands might show up for hundreds of jobs in the morning in order to get work on the piers. And this shape up system was in every port in the country and world was at that era. There was no sort of control. And so you didn't have a job, right? You might have a job. If you get a job today, you might not, and you finish your job tomorrow, you may not have another job, right? You have to find another job, right? And so this casual labor system, we often now use the term precarious, was the norm, not just in this industry, but in this industry in particular, right? Like, so you get hired by the ship, but the system resulted in a weak, divided, low-wage workforce. And then you get a job and it's really hard work. It's very dangerous work. Literally, you could die any day on the job, right? Like Local 8, like other, where unions had the power, abolished the shape up, right? Instead, employers would have to call up the union to request workers, and the workers would be dispatched by the union. In addition, the union immediately integrated its workforce. And so gangs previously of workers had been segregated by ethnicity and race. So if you had 100 people working a ship, there might be 5 gangs of 20 men. You might have a Polish gang, an Italian gang, an Irish gang, a black gang. That was literally the case. That's why the workforce was 1/3 African-American, 1/3 Irish and Irish-American, and 1/3 other Europeans, because the employers chose to basically use diversity as a weapon, right? Divide and conquer. It's been used thousands of times in the United States and other countries, right? So I.W.W, anti-racist, right, immediately ends not only the shape up, but immediately ends ethnic-based gangs, right? And of course, the effects of this we can only imagine, but in the hearts and minds of these thousands of men who start to interact much more with each other. Most of this is not documented, right? Like, I mean, we know this happened, but we don't know what people were thinking really. But nevertheless, I call this integration from below, because employers had created segregation and workers basically end segregation. This is 51 years, by the way, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 legally ended segregation by race in the United States. And they also integrated their elected officials, their social events, et cetera. They also never signed contracts, right? Because to the Wobblies, the greatest power of workers is on the job, not at the ballot box. When workers threaten to strike or strike, that is when employers listen, and only then, right? And so not only did the Wobblies never sign contracts, these are sort of oral agreements, right? That gives them the power, as they often did. They would actually walk off the job regularly in what often in I.W.W parlance was called direct action tactics, so that, you know, the Wobblies say you have to hire only Wobblies, but if the boss tries to hire some non-I.W.W members, everyone had to wear a button on their hat or lapel, right? You could see who wasn't in the union. They would basically strike and say, you're going to lay off these other guys and call the union hall in order to sort of hire replacements, right? And so it wasn't just the elected leaders of the union who enforced integration and Wobbly power. It actually was rank and files on their job sites that all the time essentially were asked and were expected to sort of basically be union and be union strong in some profound ways. And this was the way that the Philadelphia waterfront operated from May 1913 until the end of 1922, right? When essentially their power was broken.
So maybe just to step back a bit. Fletcher is central to the kind of that 1913 moment, right? The strike that gives rise to Local 8. But as you're saying, you know, this is a time in which there are, competing interests in terms of controlling the docks, not simply the conflict is not simply between workers and management, although that's the big one, or workers and the owners of different shipping companies, but also between the AFL, ILA union, or sorry, don't want to use acronyms, International Longshoremen's Association,
Right.
and the I.W.W, they're both interested in organizing this very diverse set of dock workers or stevedores, and why do they go with why do the workers go with the what is it about Philadelphia that allows the I.W.W to win the workers in on the Philadelphia docks? What's going on?
Well, that's an important question. The ILA, the International Longshoremen Association, which still represents dock workers on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, including in Philadelphia now. That union was typical AFL. They were segregated by craft and race. And so in a port like New York, for instance, African-Americans were excluded from the union for a long time, but then were allowed into a so-called Jim Crow local. And in Manhattan and Brooklyn, there were basically separate locals for Irish, for Italians, but also by particular skills. That was the case in other US ports. Philadelphia had failed to basically succeed in organizing. The ILA wants in, but had never succeeded. Really, I suggest, and it's reasonable, even though, again, documentation is limited, unfortunately, Fletcher being a Wobbly already in Philadelphia and therefore being a prominent Black person, no doubt was important in convincing at least a significant part of the I.W.W.'s Black population to sort of join and stay true, right? Like Fletcher had a lot of experience organizing among predominantly white workforces too, right? Like, and so I'm not just saying he might only appeal to Black workers, he actually very likely appealed to the non-Black workers. But it's significant that you had a Black Wobbly on the ground, right? Like in addition to these others, because, well, there's this just massive long history of racism and suspicion. Booker T. Washington, the most prominent Black man of that generation, advocated Blacks to be strikebreakers because it was so well known that unions often colluded with employers to keep Blacks out of industries. And so what you have here is an example of something very different, right? Like, and arguably, it's not only because of Fletcher, of course, but without Fletcher, it's hard to imagine actually that Local 8 would have been born. I often switch back and forth between Fletcher and Local 8 because they are one and the same, and to many of us, and really with, and Local 8 for its incredibly, in my opinion, impressive sort of multiracial organizing. It's also hard to disassociate from its Black leader, right, Fletcher. Yeah, and so really, in a way, the book is very much focused on Fletcher, but to tell the story of Fletcher is also to tell the story of the union that he helped found and lead.
Right. So I feel like let me get back to Fletcher a bit, which is, one of the things that I thought was really impressive with this book, and is that, as you state in the introduction, and as Robin D.G. Kelley states in his really beautiful foreword to the book, is that, working class people, like working class leaders like Ben Fletcher, they oftentimes they don't leave a paper trail. That is, you have to kind of build, you have to kind of try to interpolate their personality from all these different sources, and you do such a good job of that, given the limitations of the material. And one of the things that comes out is that not only was he an intellect and an organizer, but he was a funny person. That is, he had a very good sense of humor, and there's all sorts of stories that you tell in the book that kind of get at that. And I don't really have a question there, but maybe you could talk about that, and also maybe the process of just spending decades of your life trying to find out about this person. Like what is it like to try to put someone together? And I mean,
Yeah, well, so Fletcher is a fascinating figure to me. I learned of him as a grad student and continue to sort of be fascinated and then continue to learn about him 25 years later. So like a lot of non-elite people, he didn't have a lot of paper trail, like you said. He shows up in the census. There's a handful of letters that show up, but no doubt he wrote many others that simply didn't get preserved for any number of reasons. Ironically, because he was arrested and sent to federal prison where he and others had their correspondence read both in and outgoing, a lot of the documents in the book actually include letters and sort of spying on Fletcher. So some of what we know about Fletcher is only because the federal government was so interested in him and other I.W.W. leaders, that they invested all these resources, right, to sort of spy on him, punish him, and then imprison him, right? And we get the benefit of that in some ways, right? Like he was considered to be really funny, even though we have no audio of him. But the sort of most famous stories that are repeated many times are from his trial, where he and 100 other Wobblies were in this mass trial in Chicago in 1918 during World War I, and accused of violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts, as you mentioned. So Fletcher at one point turns to his sort of buddy, Big Bill Haywood, who's the most prominent member on trial, and he says, geez, there'd be no color at all in this trial if it weren't for me, right? Like, and so, because he was the only African-American in the bunch. After the jury came back in under 30 minutes with all 100, all guilty on all counts, meaning that they basically hadn't considered any of the evidence or any of the individuals when they just said everyone's guilty, he turned also to Fletcher, according to Haywood, turned to Haywood and said, you know, the judge isn't using very good grammar today. Bill's like, how's that been? And he's like, well, our sentences are much too long. And supposedly when all of them were then imprisoned in Cook County Jail again, which was sort of famous for the Haymarket martyrs were there. B.B. King later did a famous album live from Cook County Jail, right? Then they're all thrown on this train, right? And shipped a day west to Leavenworth, Kansas. And he supposedly conducted a mock trial aboard the train, making fun of the judge who had just sort of sentenced them to 10 to 30 years in prison. And so some of these stories are so rich and tantalizing, even though they're few, right? I mean, there's so much more I would love to know. But because I only had so much knowledge about him, the original, the first edition, and then this one is twice as long, but most of the book, the majority of the book is actually everything that Fletcher ever wrote that I have ever found, or was written about him, both during his life and after. And so the majority of the book are these 125 or so documents that I include brief introductions to provide some help. But the effect of this, well, it's a very different organization for a biography, right? But the effect is that the reader can be a historian, right? So that they can read these primary sources for themselves and draw their own conclusions. I do try to provide some guides, because sometimes there's things that are simply unknown to the average person in 2021 about something, say, from 1921. But the bulk of the book is in that format, although it, as you said a minute ago, it also includes this really wonderfully written foreword by the brilliant historian Robert D.G. Kelly, who was kind enough to sort of do that because he very much was taken, even before I started my interest in him. I learned from Robin that he in grad school also sort of was fascinated by Ben Fletcher and Local 8, although he never ended up writing about him until he wrote this 3,000 word forward. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this, well, you're in good company. You know, there's, you know, one of the things that it made me think of, the structure of the book itself is very unique. That is, I mean, it's, and this is further incentive for people listening to pick it up and check out what I'm actually talking about, which is that you know, it's primary sources, it's letters, it's all kind of you know, organized, I think chronologically, you know, with brief notes that Peter introduces, and you know, it allows you to be your own kind of, it allows you to kind of see the material itself, but it also has, and it just came to me, it has this like this Brechtian quality, not to be too pretentious, but it allows you to kind of see the labor that goes into the narrative, right? That you're presented with this, this story, but then you actually see the work, the work that goes, and you can see them, you know, you can see both of them happening at the same time. So it has this very cool dialectical quality, and so that's very cool.
Yeah, I received, after the first edition and my other book, Wobbly's on the Waterfront, were published, people found me, right? Which is wonderful. And so one of the reasons the second edition is nearly twice as long is because I had help, right? From people who were just excited about the stories of Ben Fletcher and the union that he was a part of. And, that was genealogical help. That was sort of all sorts of other things. I got to meet a man who might be on this right now, Anatol Dolgoff, the son of Sam and Esther Dolgoff, who were good friends of Fletcher in the 1930s and 40s. He's, as far as I know, the last person who really has any memories of Fletcher from the 1940s when he lived in New York City, because Fletcher lived his last 18 years in Brooklyn and was buried in Brooklyn. And so that was all because of the original edition of the book, right? And Wobbly's on the Waterfront, that then more people came and helped me because of their own shared passion, although I continue to do work too, I promise. So the format is, but it's in a way, this book was crowd sort of sourced. And in another way, I actually found documents since this book even was published in the last few months. And so it's like, there's not gonna be a third edition, don't worry. But there are more things out there, right? And so I don't say it's everything about Fletcher, but it's everything I could find about or by him. But I suspect that there's more that will sort of show up in 2021 because of, hopefully raising awareness about him.
So there's a different set of questions. These are more about, these are probably harder questions for a historian because they're about the present, but work with me here in that, it's this part of what I think is important, part of, what I hope to talk about, what is the legacy of Ben Fletcher? And there's a part of it which is, well, no one knows about Ben Fletcher, so part of it is creating that legacy or creating a narrative on, how should we understand him, his ideas, what he represented, his, what he accomplished with, local aid. That is, you have at the end of your introduction, you have this great kind of ending. In 2020, 100 years on, the working class has yet to catch up to Fletcher and his union. For those who wish for a socialist world, or as the Wobblies proclaimed more than a century ago, to build a new society from within the ashes of the old, anti-racist revolutionary unions still offer a path not yet taken. So if you could just expand on that sentiment, what do you want this book to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I joke that I'm very much inspired by Howard Zinn and others like him who sort of seek a usable past, right? Who want to sort of think about and learn from the past because I care about the present and want a better future, right? John Sweeney, the president of AFL-CIO, passed away just this week. And I read the New York Times obituary, and it was praising him for fighting racism and sexism and xenophobia in the AFL-CIO in the 1990s and early 2000s, right? The idea that 30 years after the Civil Rights Act, right, that the AFL-CIO still hadn't effectively rooted out those problems speaks volumes, right? And that 20 years after Sweeney was, after he left the AFL-CIO, right, a significant minority of the white union movement, forget about the white working class, right, white men and women who are members of unions who voted for Trump, right, and so we have major work to do, right? I don't want to only bash white working class people. I mostly blame white rich people for the problems of our society. But I am mindful that those of us who actually see a better and alternative future need to first sort of do work within our own ranks. And so for Fletcher's, I wouldn't know about the legacy, but the lessons, right, is that unions like local aid led by Fletcher in the I.W.W. prioritized anti-racism and anti-xenophobia. It was sort of at their core. That's one of the reasons they weren't as powerful and large, right? Because a lot of people were not on those teams. And also that sort of did not ingratiate them to the bosses, to the government, et cetera. Right? But Nevertheless, in 2021, I think more of us know now than we did maybe 20 years ago when CUNY was president, right? The path to sort of justice has to first go through dealing with sexism, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, right? Our most recent president emboldened people who embrace those sort of hated ideologies, right? Unions have to be at the center of this, right? Because if you're asking yourself, how do working class people do this? The most important working class institution in terms of power, pick another, right? And so as weak as unions are now, they're still the best sort of tool, I would suggest, to fighting against the divisions of our time, but also because underneath that, the division is, of course, our economic inequality and sort of the capitalism. And that Fletcher was always there for, like many others, sort of like race and class matters are inextricably linked. There's no need to argue about which is first. Instead, we just think about both are problems and both have to be solved together, not separately. Yeah.
All right, so this has gone way too fast. I'm looking at the time, so I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'm gonna turn to the Q&A because there's a bunch of really good questions from people who know a lot and deserve to hear from you. So one of the things I did want to ask, and this is dealing with this race and class issue and how. I mean, you just said, we could spend an endless amount of time, and we do, talking about, well, what, how should we, is this, how should we, what should we prioritize, but I think there's a lesson in the book because of Fletcher's own very, complex views on, questions of race. And one is that Fletcher was a Wobbly, and like many members of the I.W.W, saw interracial unionism as a tool for the abolition of the wage system, and that that workers were workers. And then, workers, Black workers and white workers, Italian workers, Slovakian workers, because I feel at the turn of the century, you had all sorts of different flavors of white people, that these are workers and that they need to come together, as workers to fight. At the same time, recognizing that, many Black workers, were confronted with racism that, made that identity very important. And so something like, this is the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. And you can imagine the challenge of interracial unionism at a moment in which the society is fraught in these ways. And it kind of gets to, we had talked earlier about the Phil Foner kind of comment about, that the how you deal with the color line, the race problem, for many in the I.W.W, the race problem was really a class problem, but as he was saying, for many in the Black community, the race problem was a race problem, and so, that's a very convoluted kind of question, but it's this, how do you square these, or how does Fletcher square these, or how does Fletcher help us in this current moment figure out the relationship?
Yeah, well, Fletcher wasn't a theoretician. He was an organizer and a speaker, and so he didn't write long treatises, but we know what he thought. And we know also from his life, no one had to tell him that Black people were at risk, right? That white workers and Black workers had differences. Ben Fletcher was threatened with the lynching in Norfolk, Virginia, where he was organizing in early 1917. And he regularly went up and down the Atlantic coast to organize dock workers. And in Norfolk and further south, there were African Americans, but also in northern cities, he didn't only organize Black workers on the waterfront, but he was often sent to places to try to organized African Americans in Baltimore and Norfolk and Providence, right? And so the fact that, we can only assume that he was threatened and dealt with racism in any number of occasions. There's only a handful of documented occurrences, right? But I think the Tulsa point that you brought up is appropriate. It's the 100th anniversary in Memorial Day weekend, 4 months from now, to the Tulsa Race Massacre. So after that happened, local aid held a forum, right? It's amazing that we know this happened, but because it's again, it's sort of just a little glimpse of what they probably happened all the time. But we know from records, right, from newspapers that local aid held a forum about Tulsa after it occurred, right? And we know from A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owens' magazine, The Messenger, because they reported, they were at the meeting where they talked about it, right? And they talked about basically, they saw it as a class issue, right? This is about Black workers and white workers being divided, and that those who advocate for Black-only institutions, and at that time, Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, was the largest Black organization in the world, right? And so, there were people who were saying, we need Black unions, right? Fletcher rejected that, right? He was saying, no, we need to be in interracial institutions. Let's keep in mind that Black people are only 12% of the population of the USA, right? Like the idea that you're gonna have a Black-only union isn't the path towards socialism, right? And so A, acknowledge and sort of tackle and target and name racism, but B, don't do it, in their opinion, in Black institutions, Garveyite in particular. Randolph's paper, since it was a socialistic magazine, right, sort of agreed with that view. And so that's why they were so excited about and reported regularly on Fletcher and Local 8, and a number of those documents are in the book too.
Okay, so I'm gonna turn it over to the pick some, go to the Q&A, because I think there's a lot going on here. So so there's a couple, maybe I can combine a couple questions. So there's a question about, what percentage of the I.W.W. was Black, and this person cites Patrick Renshaw's the Wobblies to say that maybe around 10%. So first, maybe, how many Black people were part of the I.W.W.? And second, and maybe it's a slightly different question, but what was the relationship between Ben Fletcher and A. Philip Randolph and The Messenger? So maybe if you can take those two questions, and I'll look for some more.
Of course. So we don't really know what percentage of I.W.W. members were of any ethnic or racial group. They just didn't keep that information, and the federal government confiscated many of their records during the wartime raids and destroyed many of them subsequently. Anecdotally, 1 in 10 American members of the I.W.W. were Black. I don't disagree with that, but I really can't prove it either, right? I think it's right. We do know that in Texas and Louisiana, for example, there was tens of thousands of African Americans and white workers in the Brotherhood of Timber Workers in the early 19-teens. That's the other sort of great example in the US of Black Wobblies. But we know that they show up in other places, but never in the numbers, right? In particular, in a sort of a specific local or industry, right? Fletcher had ties with and presumably knew well many other prominent Black people of his era, but again, the paper trail is limited. But we know that Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph knew Fletcher and his union because they wrote about it all the time. Did they know each other? Well, again, going back to the Leavenworth, right, to the federal government records, they also kept checks on who was writing to whom and vice versa. So we know that actually, I know, right, that Fletcher corresponded with Randolph and Owen because it shows up in the Leavenworth sort of correspondence records. We don't know what all those letters said, but we know that they were corresponding, right? And that Fletcher also corresponded with other prominent Black radicals in Chicago, in Boston, like William Monroe Trotter, who was the publisher of a paper called The Guardian, which was sort of like a militant Black nationalist paper. William Monroe Trotter was sort of an amazing figure, right? And that Fletcher
there's a new book about him.
Yeah, there's a new biography out on Trotter that's supposedly very good. And also that and Fletcher briefly lived in Boston in 1917. And so I, again, can't prove what they were doing together, but they show up in corresponding, right? Like, and so that's, again, it's sort of a taste. It's sort of a hint, right? Like we could guess. I've often wondered if Fletcher knew Claude McKay, the Jamaican radical who lived in Harlem and wrote, a Harlem Renaissance writer. In Home to Harlem, there's actually a section that clearly is about local aid. Not Fletcher, but about the Union as being anti-racist. There's this 2-page sort of story where the main character is scabbing in New York City, right? And he's like, I don't care about scabbing, you know, because white unions are racist. But in Philadelphia, actually, I happen to know that there was a prominent union. I don't know if Fletcher and McKay knew each other. It seems like they probably did. But again, like being sort of saying what you think and then being able to document are often two different things, and it can be frustrating. I almost want to write a novel about Ben Fletcher because I could sort of almost take some liberties that I hesitate to do, you know, a work of nonfiction.
That's another hint at the screenwriter in the comments section. All right, so here's two questions related to local aid. So, you know, what did the hiring system look like after local aid abolished the shape up? And then the second is, you know, when Fletcher was in Leavenworth, what happened to the local aid? What did his absence mean for them?
Yeah, so the hiring system, again, we have limited knowledge, but we know the union had a hall, 121 Catherine Street. That building was torn down in the 90s due to gentrification, but like that, you know, the phones existed at that time, even though most working people didn't have them in their homes. And we know that basically the employers would have had to have contacted the union to sort of request workers, right? And so they obliterated the shape up and instead had a dispatch system that's actually similar to, if we don't know all the details about, what the US West Coast I.W.W, the International Long-Term Warehouse Union, how they actually operated starting from the late 1930s forward, right? So they tried to create an equitable system that didn't discriminate based on race, but beyond that, we don't know actually how their hiring system worked, except that you had to be a member in good standing. You had to have paid your monthly dues. Dues were very low for this union, but nevertheless, they existed. And they issued a button every month. And if you go online, you can see some of these buttons, or in my book, you can see some of these buttons. Some people on eBay spend lots of money on these. I don't, but they're out there, which is amazing, right? Like to think about. When Fletcher was in prison, the union, and I should say 5 other leaders in Local 8 were also imprisoned. The union was weakened by that, but it's a testament to the union that taking out its head, if you will, their leaders, didn't result in the death of the body. They had other leaders who sort of stepped up in the absence, and Local 8 survived for another 4 years after the imprisonment of Fletcher. Fletcher shows up back in Philadelphia when he gets released on bond, and then after his sentence is commuted in late 1922. But Local 8 held on to power, actually went on a huge strike in 1920 for the 8-hour day and failed. 1922, late in the year, there's another strike/lockout that ultimately divides the union partially by race, because xenophobia and racism are actually rising in the early 1920s. The Klan is huge, several million members, but also the Congress has just basically will close the door to widespread immigration from Europe due to dislike of immigrants, right? And so, you know, the union can't handle government repression, employer opposition, racism and xenophobia, as well as actually a challenge to the emergence of communism as another force on the left that had not existed before World War I. And so it's actually covered a bit in the introduction to the book, but that's the not short version, is that Local 8 will survive for another 5 years, but then will be destroyed. The AFL will later take over, but the shape up will show up again. So employers and the union will both allow, if you will, the shape up to return, and will be around into the late 60s. Segregated gangs will return after Local 8 is defeated. And that'll also remain the case until actually early 1970s, right? In Philadelphia and some other ports that the ILA controlled. And so, although the union existed and they had an 8-hour day and a contract, they, in terms of race relations, there hasn't they have yet to return to the ability to the level of 1921 Philadelphia, right? Like as far as the Philadelphia Union today. And from what I gather from friends in Philadelphia, well, there's some progressive people in that local, but there's also some Trumpists, right? In that local in Philadelphia.
All right, two more. These are I have some good ones now. So here's a. Can you maybe say anything about the I.W.W. organizing in the South during kind of the same time? And then a question from Brian McTiernan, who I know. I'm glad you're listening, Brian. How this is a question kind of about how you do history, or how you think as a historian. How as a historian do you kind of weigh the success of local aid? On the one hand, they had a strong interracial union. On the other hand, the IW's goals were to end capitalism with the general strike. So do you assess local aid on their own terms or on the I.W.W.'s terms? How do you do that?
Yeah, so keeping in mind that in the early 20th century, the American South was the least industrial section of the country, that the I.W.W. organized in southern places, but unions generally, historically and today, right, like are lower union density, right? And so the I.W.W. did organize in Texas, in Louisiana, in the timber industry, both in the sort of the forests, but also in the mills, right? That was actually where they were most successful in the South, but they also organized farm workers, railroad workers, and others. But in the South, the unions were much smaller and weaker, but also because industry was less, right? It's still much more agricultural. As far as the I.W.W. and Local 8 and Ben Fletcher's, how do we sort of, conclusions do we draw? Well, it's undeniable, right? Like capitalism survived and thrived and sort of beat, you might say, Local 8 and Fletcher down. That's the case for every sort of anti-capitalist vision and organization so far, right? Like, and so I don't particularly look at the I.W.W.'s failure to sort of overcome capitalism in the same way I don't blame the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or anarchists or others for that. Like, I mean, that tells us actually that capitalism is powerful, right? Like that despite lots of people's vision and dreams and sort of actually efforts, the system is strong, right? Like anyone who underappreciates the power of capital is immensely mistaken, right? That's actually one thing to take away, because the first Red Scare was really against the I.W.W. Before the communists existed, the first target of the federal government during World War I was the I.W.W., right? And so when we think of the Red Scare, we often think of communists, but actually that is not incorrect. But the first target of the Red Scare were actually the Wobblies. It's not easy to sort of stand up to the power of employers, capital, and with government allies, right? Like, of course, Eugene Debs learned that in 1894 when the Pullman strike shut down the railroad industry until the U.S. Army came in and put its sort of thumb on the scales and sort of basically beat that strike. These are just things we have to be mindful of, right? Like, I guess as a historian, I think to myself, like, well, we have to see what people sort of agitated for and how they succeeded and failed both. And then sort of maybe sort of learn some lessons. Yeah. So as a historian, I would just say that, in Philadelphia, Ben Fletcher and this union was incredibly progressive. We haven't even talked about how racist Philadelphia is. I mean, actually, that this happened in Philadelphia. There were easier cities that this could have happened. It's sort of noteworthy that Philadelphia was where this occurred, right? But they did fail in their sort of long-term agenda, right? Fletcher died poor and buried in unmarked grave in Brooklyn, but he actually didn't change his views. He actually very much remained committed to these ideals that he had embraced in his late teens. When he died at the age of 59, he still was very much a true believer in these ideas.
So you mentioned or slipped in that Fletcher is buried in an unmarked grave in Brooklyn. Maybe I'll use this opportunity to give you, because I know this is something that you're working on, and and I think it connects. I mean, it connects to kind of your this public history thing that you're doing. Not only are you teaching public history, not only is the structure of the book very much about, crowdsourcing material and building something together, but yeah. So tell us about this making Ben Fletcher's legacy concrete or stone.
Yeah, or granite.
Or granite.
So Fletcher lived for as far as we know, like say the last at least 15 years of his life in Brooklyn and Bedford-Stuyvesant. At that time, and Bed-Stuy wasn't as black as it later became, right? It actually became more heavily black in the post-World War II era. And so some of his white radical friends also lived in the same neighborhood. But anyway, he had health problems going back to the mid-30s. And so was poor. His wife was probably the breadwinner. And, buried. Actually, 100 people showed up. There was a New York Times obituary, as well as in some newspapers elsewhere that are covered in the book, but unmarked grave, right? And so there's friends of mine and I, along with allies, have created a sort of a committee, quote unquote, right? Where we're sort of have generated draft text. We've been in communication with the cemetery. We will soon announce, but not yet, a fundraising campaign to raise, I don't know, a few grand to sort of get a granite marker for him in the section of the cemetery where he was buried, Evergreens Cemetery in Brooklyn. And we're excited about that. I can even envision us succeeding and having late in 2021, perhaps post when COVID's a little less ferocious, right? Doing a public unveiling, maybe a really prominent one, right? In Brooklyn at the cemetery, because he deserves to sort of be remembered. Of course, I'm proud of the book, but having a place to go to sort of honor him, I think will also be meaningful for many people. And after we succeed with that, we will also then push to try to do something in his home place of Philadelphia, maybe a mural or something of that sort, because Philadelphians also should do more to embrace the legacy and history that of their city in this regard.
Great. So we are more or less at time, and this has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I mentioned before we went on that we share a kind of strange strange moment. Peter, the last time I was in a restaurant was with Peter in March of last year, and so it's great to talk to you, and especially about this book. I know it's hard to do a book tour at this time, but thanks to the technology, we can reach a lot of people. And I know all the people who we've had on today. I appreciate them tuning in, because I think the story is the story of Ben Fletcher, what he represents, is really important and couldn't be more timely given the kind of insane times we find ourselves in. There's I wanted to read this section of the book, which I felt like it captured the whole thing, which is like Ben Fletcher, an avowedly, Local 8, an avowedly revolutionary union led by a black man, forced corporations in America's third biggest city and fifth largest port to deal with a union in which the great majority of members were African American and European immigrants. And they did it without ever signing a contract, instead enforcing the demands based upon the ever-present threat of a strike. Fletcher's name and the union he helped lead, have largely been forgotten, and by those who cannot imagine or oppose the vision espoused by Fletcher and other Wobblies. Ben Fletcher deserves far more recognition than he has received, and I think this book and all the work you've done on it goes some way to do that, and you're still working at it, as you mentioned with the gravestone. So I want to give you the final word, but thank you.
Well, thank you for reading my book so closely, and thanks to everyone who signed in and sort of watched this event. Kafui's grandfather actually is also in the book. He didn't mention, but one of his grandparents was a Wobbly in the early 1920s, and in the appendix there's a few documents, not about or by Fletcher, but relevant about Black workers in the I.W.W. And so it's thrilling to sort of actually join Kafui, but also you know, the School of Labor and Urban Studies. I really respect CUNY, especially as a former New York resident, for the mission, right? I work at a public university as well. And so I'm proud to sort of be connected with you guys. And thank you again.
Perfect. All right, so there are some announcements, so don't log off quite yet, but thank you all for joining. Pick up the book, read the book, yeah, this has been great. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kafui. Thank you, Peter, so much. Please, as Kafui mentioned, please hang on. We're experimenting with a new segment called Community Announcements after each event. And we definitely want to give, to begin with, we want to give our co-sponsors a chance to make important announcements. I'll say, if you didn't catch it, it's in the text. If you're interested in joining the Ben Fletcher Memorial Committee, you can send Peter and the other folks working on that an email to benfletchermemorial@protonmail.com. So you'll find that, again, that email in the chat. And to get this community announcement segment started off, we'd love to welcome Michelle Flores from Brandworkers, which is a great labor organization based here in New York City. And I'll let Michelle tell you all more about her organization and what's new.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Peter, for your remarkable scholarship and for highlighting this important bit of our labor history. And thank you, Kafui, for moderating such an excellent conversation. So excited to join you all today. Brandworkers is an organization of food factory workers here in New York City who are organizing a union with the I.W.W. And we're working on a campaign right now to support workers at a bakery in Queens who were targeted with the complicity of their company by ICE and ousted after an ICE audit in 2017, and they've been struggling and fighting since then. They continue to remain in solidarity with one another and with direct action. And I just wanted to share a link where the company is refusing to talk with them and come back to the table, and we're asking folks to help us bring them back to the table. We're having a Twitter storm, and I'll just make sure I share that link with you all in the chat. And just thank you again so much for this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And we'll make sure that those links are in the chat. I think we've put them in before, and we'll make sure that the more information, great, there it is again. You'll get information about our two speakers and their books, as well as our co-sponsors and follow-up emails. So please, these are great learning opportunities. Get involved with local labor and community partners. Let's see if we have, is there anybody else with any community announcements? Please just raise your hands. We just lowered the hands, but raise your hands if you want to come on screen and join us. All right, Gary, I'm going to bring you on. And again, please be respectful. I think you all know that part. And please make sure your announcements are about events or resources, learning opportunities that are free and open to the public. So Gary, if you can start your video and unmute yourself, and you'll be on. And Merlene, we're going to also bring you on. Gary, are you there? Okay, Merlene, if you could start your video too and unmute yourself. Okay, we're having problems. These folks are not coming on. Bob, you're now a panelist too. Just unmute yourself and start your video. You should be getting a prompt. Hi, Bob. What's your announcement?
Hi, my name is Bob, and I want to tell people about a new resource. It's called Teacher Unions and Social Justice, Organizing for the Schools and Communities Our Students Deserve. It's published by Rethinking Schools. I'm one of the co-editors along with Michael Charney and Jesse Hagopian, and I encourage people to check it out at rethinkingschools.org. It's 60 different contributors, 70 different illustrations and photos, all about the need to build social justice unions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. And Bob, while you're still a panelist, if you have a link or to a webpage or anything, feel free to put that in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, we're going to hear from, let's bring up Rebecca. Rebecca, if you don't mind starting your video. Hey, Rebecca.
I think I'm there. New deal for CUNY. There's an event tomorrow to really look at how we can organize better in New York State for public education and for CUNY. And I'll find something and put it in the chat. I hope I can do it quickly enough, but I believe it's at 11 o'clock tomorrow. It's the launch, a big launch event for the new deal for CUNY.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yeah, and please do put that in the chat. Again, while we wait, I don't know if Gary or will join us. But again, our next event will be Tuesday, February 16th, Leading for Change at a Critical Time, What Do Leaders Need? It's sponsored by the School of Labor and Urban Studies and the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership at the City College of New York. And the event will be featuring Christina Jimenez from United We Dream and Ense Ufot from the New Georgia Project. It should be a great event, and it will be moderated by our very own Deepak Bhargava, Distinguished Lecturer in Urban Studies here at SLU. And I think we will end it there. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us in the future. At future events, please keep in mind we'll have this community announcement segment to allow our audience to engage and share free resources that are open to the public, learning opportunities, volunteer opportunities. Thanks again so much for joining us. And yeah, the chat will be open. We'll go to some slides and music now, and you can check out everything in the chat, links to what the folks who made announcements spoke about. Thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you Tuesday, February 16th for our next event.